Continuing our reading of Robert Crisp's Brazen Chariots, Part 4, page 12, Gone were my dreams of the wide sand seas of Libya and the green groves of Cyrenaica running down to the Mediterranean, and the freedom of independent movement far from brigadiers and colonels and standing orders. It was defense duties and training for me, with everybody else, and no way past it. I went back to Heliopolis unhappy, but in the mood to make the best of it. Fortunately, the tempo of events speeded up considerably in the next month or two, and we all got a vague impression of something big being concocted. New men were arriving every week to replace the losses in Greece, and in August the first of our new tanks was delivered. We had seen the sleek, fast Crusader tanks that were going to other armored regiments in Egypt at that time, but knew they were not for us. We were to get an American tank, known officially as the American M3 Light Cavalry Tank, Stuart for short. Until then, we had been equipped with ancient A-10s and A-13s and even some A-9s dragged out of various war museums and exhibitions. They were ponderous square things like mobile prefab houses and just about as flimsy. By far their worst failing was their complete inability to move more than a mile or two in any sort of heavy going without breaking a track or shedding one on a sharp turn. Of the 60-odd tanks 3RTR had taken to Greece at the beginning of the year, not half a dozen were casualties of direct enemy action. All the others had been abandoned with broken tracks or other mechanical breakdowns. They littered the passes and defiles of Macedonia and Thessaly, stripped of their machine guns but otherwise intact. They were of no help to the enemy. No other army would have contemplated using them. I like to think of them, even now, furnishing some sort of chilly, overcrowded dwelling place for a family of homeless Greek peasants. Whoever was responsible for the design of British tanks in between the wars ought to have a considerable weight on his conscience. As a matter of fact, the design was due not to any one particular individual, but had been conceived by a pressure group, obsessed by an obsolete idea. The principal influence brought to bear on tank design and tactics was the cavalry school of thought. The strategists wanted to make a tank which was as much like a horse as possible, and which could be used in action in more or less the same way. The charge of the Light Brigade was their idea of the proper way to fight a battle. They merely substituted tanks for horses. Very unfortunately for the Royal Armored Corps, the cavalry influence predominated at the War Office before and during the last war. It probably still does, and the fast, lightly armored tank was the result. Unfortunately, too many cavalry regiments employed the same gallant tactics as the Earl of Cardigan. They learnt the hard way. We regarded the advent of our new tanks with a good deal more vital interest than a newly married couple inspecting their first home. We were also fascinated by the group of American Army technicians who came with them. The Stuart was a strange-looking contraption, straight from Texas, tall in the saddle and with the western flavor, accentuated by a couple of Browning machine guns and the rangy Texans. The main armament was similar to the pea-shooter that all British tanks carried at that time, but the frontal armor was much thicker than in our own light tanks and cruisers. The really intriguing things about the M3 were its engine and the tracks. Drivers gasped in astonishment when the back covers were lifted off. It was simply an airplane engine stuck in a tank with radial cylinders and a fan that looked like a propeller. Fuel was to present a new problem to the supply services, as the engine ran efficiently only on high-octane aviation spirit. But this was not our problem, and the consensus of opinion was that anything that was likely to assist in a fast takeoff was probably a good thing. After the engines had received their share of comment, we gave our undivided attention to the tracks. There had never been anything like them in the British Army. Each track link was mounted in solid rubber blocks on which the vehicle moved. After one look, we wondered why the hell British tank designers had never thought of it. As soon as I could, I got my crew into one of the Stuarts and headed out of Heliopolis for the first patch of open, sandy desert, not always as easy to find as you might think. We tested her for speed first and found that on a good going we could get up to 40 miles an hour. It was a comforting thought in the circumstances to know that the German Marks III and IV could manage only 20 or so. Then I told my driver, Whaley, to make a few fast turns and waited with some foreboding for the inevitable bang-clatter and swerving halt that meant a broken track. Nothing happened. It was wonderful. That tank handled like a well-trained cow pony. "Let's see just what it will take," I said down the intercom. "Try and shed one of these tracks." Whaley put her through a variety of turns and maneuvers that made the sandy floor of the desert look like an ice rink after a hockey match, spurting up great fountains of sand and dust behind the tracks. "That'll do," I shouted to the driver at last. "We're beginning to wear out the desert." Back at the camp, the CO and a small crowd were waiting for us. We climbed out, all grinning happily. "Well, Whaley," I asked my driver, "what do you think of it?" He, plainly under the influence of the nearby Texan, beamed and said simply, "It's a honey, sir." From that moment, they were never known as anything else.